Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I am here to give you a bit of a 50mm showdown. I like to do this when I actually have an opportunity to have two of the main competing lenses on hand. And I know that, just by the numbers, you all are interested in direct comparisons between lenses. And so in this case, I am looking at the newest 50mm f1.4 on the Sony platform, which is the Samyang AF 50mm f1.4. This is their Mark II of that lens. And as you noted in my review of that lens, it is a marked improvement over the first generation of the lens in a whole lot of levels. Here I have what has been my Sony 50mm lens for the last several years, and that is the Sony Zeiss Planar 50mm f1.4. A great lens, one that I gave a very positive review to. However, there are a few factors, as we're going to see, where there is some give and take between these lenses. Now, I will note that both of these lenses have been supplanted by the even better Sony 50mm f1.2 G Master lens. And it, of course, is the top of the heap lens. If price is no object, that is the 50mm lens to own on the Sony platform. I do recognize, however, that price is often an object, and so that G Master lens runs you around $2,000, the Sony Zeiss Planar about $1,500, and right now you can get this new Samyang at a price point of around $700. So obviously that is a significantly different price points, with the GM being almost 3 times the price of this, and of course even the Planar being about twice the price of this lens plus a little bit more. So obviously that's going to be a factor for some of you. So maybe some of you are considering the Samyang, saying, well, I'm on a tighter budget, is it worth investing in compared to the Planar, which continues to be sold? So I hope to answer that question somewhat as a part of this breakdown here today. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is sponsored by NordVPN, the VPN selected as the best in 2020 by VPN Mentor and recommended by top technology experts. Due to the pandemic, we are all online more than ever, and that means our precious data is even more at risk. NordVPN anonymizes your browsing data, protects your personal information, and even enables you to access content blocked in certain regions. Using NordVPN is incredibly simple, with apps for all your devices that allow you to get protected with just a click of a button. And with over 5,500 servers in 59 countries worldwide, it is easy to get protection without compromising speed. Visit NordVPN/Dustin or use coupon code Dustin to get 70% off your subscription.
So let's start by just looking at some of the basic raw statistics of these two lenses. As you can see, the Sony is significantly larger than what the Samyang is. And one of the main pluses, or potential plus for you, is if you're concerned about having something that is more moderately sized, more lightweight, then obviously the Samyang is going to have some things to recommend it as compared to the Sony. And so I'm going to try to give you a breakdown of those things. So as far as the numbers go, the Sony lens is 83.5mm in diameter by 108mm in length with a 72mm front filter thread. It weighs in about 780 grams. The Samyang, by comparison, is 80.1mm, and so just a little bit narrower in diameter. It is 88.9mm in length, so as you can see, it is close to being 20mm shorter. And then it weighs in at only 420 grams, which is pretty exceptional for a lens that is, as high performing as this lens is. That is a really low weight there. And if you compare to something like the Sigma 50mm f1.4, and so the art version that has been ported over to Sony. At this point, Sigma has not yet released a DN version of that lens. And so their DN lenses are designed for mirrorless. That is actually a ported over DSLR lens. And so it's unnecessarily large, and so it weighs in close to 1 kilogram, and so it's nearly 3 times as heavy as what the Samyang is. And so that's part of the reason why I kind of rule it out. It's in a whole nother class in terms of size, and frankly, because it's ported over, its autofocus is not as competitive as what these lenses are going to be for that simple reason. So this also has a 72mm front filter thread. So there are two different approaches here. This lens feels extremely well made. It feels very heavy and dense. It actually feels a lot like a Zeiss lens in terms of that density. And so it does, and it's hefty, nearly 800 grams. It's a heavy lens and it feels extremely well made. The Samyang feels a little bit more plasticky by comparison, but plasticky in the sense of, I would say very much like what a Canon L series lens does, in that it feels like quality plastics, and everything here seems to be reasonably well executed. When it comes to weather sealing, I have not necessarily seen an internal diagram of the weather sealing in the Sony Zeiss. I do know it has a rear gasket, and Sony does say that it does have, moisture and dust resistance. The Samyang, however, does have a diagram, and we can see that there's about 6 seal points inside. So it's hard for me to say, which lens is better sealed, but both of them do have weather sealing. Both of them also do have a feature set to them, but there's a little bit of a different approach. The Sony lens has kind of the earlier approach to some of the different features, in that it does have the aperture ring, and in this case you also have the ability to declick that aperture, and so that is a feature that was carried on to the G Master lens, and it has an AF/MF switch on the side. All that very welcome. But what it doesn't have is a focus hold button, which of course that later Sony lenses would have. By comparison, the Samyang does not have a dedicated aperture ring. It does have the focus hold button, and what it also has is a custom switch that allows you to function as a manual focus ring. You can also switch it to where it controls aperture and functions like an aperture ring. So what you don't have, however, is the ability to declick the aperture. So some give and take there as far as the feature set. As far as the feel of the build quality, I would say that the Sony feels like the better made lens in terms of its just overall feel. However, when you actually break down the features between the two lenses and the construction, there's not really a lot of difference there. So I guess it comes down to your priority, whether you like the really premium feel of the Sony, or if you're looking for something smaller and more lightweight, then obviously the Samyang is the winner there. When it comes to price, there's a clear winner here, in that obviously you can buy a couple of the Samyang lenses for the price of the Sony. So that's going to be a real world factor for some of you. So let's talk about autofocus here. Neither one of these lenses are at the G Master's level. The G Master has a quad linear motor, and so it is fast, it is accurate. It's next level in terms of autofocus performance. Sorry there, Samyang. And but in this case, the Sony has, a little bit older of its focus motor. However, it's quiet for the most part. It gets the job done. The Samyang has a linear stepping motor, and so it's not as fast in some situations, has been my observation. Although it is, when it comes to actual autofocus for stills, they feel about the same in terms of performance. But ironically, it is the Samyang that has because it has a more modern focus system and it's designed for where Sony cameras are at now, it actually functions a little bit better in some situations. So first of all, when it comes to video performance, there's not necessarily a lot of difference between the two. If we look at the focus pulls between the two lenses, we can see that they behave roughly similar. Neither one of them have any kind of real autofocus sound that you're going to pick up as a part of those video pulls. And I will say that my only distinction is that the Samyang is maybe a little bit more deliberate, but it also feels a little bit more precise relative to the Sony. But where things get interesting is that you actually get you have more situations where the Sony focus system either gives you false positives or gets stuck. So here, if I switch over and I just show you shooting actual stills back and forth, we can see that the Sony actually has a few places in my focus scenario where it gets stuck, whereas the Samyang, while it's maybe a little bit more deliberate in its focus pull, it's much more confident. And so it gets to the focus point, it sticks there, it comes back, it sticks where it's supposed to. And so the byproduct is that I actually have gotten more reliable focus results out of the Samyang than what I have over the Sony, which has been, if you look back at my long-term review, has been one of my chief criticisms of it, is that it's just a little bit less precise when it comes to autofocus than what I would expect from such a premium lens. I found the same to be true when it came to doing a test of IAF consistency. And so what I did is, in between each shot, I defocused. I took about 12 to 13 shots with both lenses, exact same conditions. And what I found is that I got just a little bit higher a keeper rate with the Samyang in that more consistently focused results. I also noted that the Samyang was more consistent in choosing the same eye again and again. So I was actually getting more repeatable focus results. Whereas with the Sony, there were a few where I could tell even the viewfinder was giving a little bit of a false positive. It went ahead and signaled that focus had been acquired even when it wasn't quite, and it did switch back and forth between eyes a little bit more, so just not as confident in terms of its overall performance. So that's one area where I would say I would give the Samyang a win there, just because of the focus consistency that I saw. Now, things get interesting when we look at a breakdown of the optical performance. And so I want to dive into that with you and to take a deep dive into the optical comparison between these two lenses. Let's take a look. So we'll start with a look at our test charts, which is the only one of these tests that I've previously shared before, so I won't linger too long here. This is 200% and Sony Alpha 1, so 50 megapixel, which all of these tests have been done on. Now, on this particular test, we saw that the Samyang actually fared really well, and it looks very sharp in the center of the frame, actually sharper here than what the Planar does. For these tests, the Samyang will be on the left, the Planar on the right. Now, at the mid-frame, there's a little bit of a shift with a slightly stronger performance on the chart for the Sony and the Samyang, but they're very close. You're kind of splitting hairs. Looking into the corner here, we see that there's a little bit of a brighter image, which we will see as a consistent theme from the Samyang with better light transmission. However, the actual contrast and sharpness favors the Sony. Stopping down to f2, we can see that in the center of the frame, both lenses look fantastic. The Samyang is still very much holding its own, however. And the mid-frame, however, there is a shift to where the Sony is obviously better in terms of contrast and resolution. And into the corners, we see that the same theme remains in that the Sony is pretty obviously better in the extreme corner. Now, when we shift to three-dimensional objects, a couple of factors I want to mention before we look at these tests. First of all is that you are going to find that it's a little less scientific. There's more room for focus variance, but at the same time, it is illuminary because there's things that you see with three-dimensional objects that you don't always see in the case of a two-dimensional object like the chart test. So what you can see is that, again, while both lenses are very strong in the center of the frame, as we've seen before, I do think that there is a little bit more contrast that shows up for the more expensive Sony lens. So you can see, for example, in the texture of the book, and in some of these fine details, they just render a little bit better. And for example, on this veneer cover, there's just more pop to it, and definitely in the Bible frame there. And I noted right up here in the corner, which we noted before, that the resolution is better on the Sony anyway. But you can see, comparing here and here, that there's a fairly obvious difference here. And if we look right off towards the edge of the frame, we can see on the I Am book that it definitely does favor the Sony, not by a huge margin, but it definitely does. Again, if we stop down to f2 and look in the center of the frame, there's a little less variance here between these two. I would say at this point they both look, awesome, and so not a huge difference there. Well, there's a book by me in there. We can see that, for example, here with my name, though, I think that on the Sony it shows just a little bit better. Moving off towards the edge here, we can see that, again, there's not a huge difference, but I would say it does favor the Sony in terms of resolution and contrast. And popping back up here, we can see that it's still better on the actual Sony lens. So let's look at close-up performance. A couple of things to note here. The Samyang actually allows you to get closer and thus gives you a little bit higher a magnification. So, for example, if we look here, you can see it's a little bit larger on the Samyang than what it is on the Sony. You'll also note, however, looking up close, that the Sony is a little bit stronger up close in its performance than what the Samyang is. Both of them do show some fringing on the autofocus area here, but I would say that the Samyang shows a little bit more fringing than what the Sony does. And if we look towards the autofocus background, hard to draw too many conclusions because everything is just so blurred out with both lenses that there is really not a lot to pick up here. So we'll look at that more with some future tests. So as noted before, the Samyang actually has the higher level of magnification, but up close, if you put the lenses an equal distance away from the camera, it actually favors the Sony. And the Sony, for the simple reason that the Sony actually, maybe it doesn't focus breathe in the way that the Samyang does. Maybe there's a little bit of a variance in their actual focal length, but definitely the Sony has a stronger level of compression or of magnification at equal distance. And so another little thing to pick up. What I wanted to look at here more, however, was how they handled this really intense, contrast transition. And you can see that the more expensive optic in the Sony is handling that a little bit better. So retaining better contrast here. Both of them show the fringing, the chromatic aberrations, but the Samyang shows a little bit more of it. If we look towards out of focus areas here, we can see again there's a difference in the amount of magnification. Both of them are producing a pretty nice looking background blur. I slightly favor the Sony in this situation, however. Now here's another test that examines a few things. Again, different kind of scene, a defocused background, and then light coming through this potted plant here. And so we can see, first of all, that if you use equivalent settings with both lenses, you definitely get a brighter image out of the Samyang. It's that better light transmission that we previously referenced. And we also, as we have seen, we get a little bit better contrast out of the Sony. I don't see a significant difference in, the background blur here. Both of them are doing similar things here with this background. And so, again, not a radical difference that I can pick up. I also did some shots to try to see if there was a difference in the amount of flare artifacts that would show up. In this particular image, I think that the lenses really look nearly identical. They're both handling it quite well. No loss of contrast that I can see, and the bright sun entering through the windows is not causing any kind of nasty ghosting artifacts. In this secondary shot with both lenses stopped down, again, a fairly similar performance. There's a tiny bit of a ghosting artifact here, very hard to see. A little bit more pronounced one on the Sony Planar and a little bit of one here as well. I think that there's a little bit more distinct, light shafts that are coming off the Samyang. But again, I wouldn't call it a radical difference between either one of the lenses. Now here's a really kind of bright scene, both at F1.4 of Loki. And so again, it was a challenging scene that I wanted to see how they both handle it. So there is going to be a little bit of chromatic aberration on both of them. However, in this particular instance, neither one really stands out all that much. I think that there's a little more green fringing on the Samyang. In this particular shot, the Samyang delivers a little bit crisper a result. It could be just this particular situation, but it just goes to show that in the real world, there's variance, there's give and take between the lenses handle, and we'll see that more as we go. Nothing radically different, once again, in the look between the two lenses. Here's another shot with just pure blur, and in this case it was the maximum amount of blur that I could produce with both lenses in this situation at this particular focus distance. And so we can see that while the framing is a little bit tighter on the Sony, as we have seen previously, what we can also see is that the Samyang is able to defocus a little bit more because it can focus a little bit closer. So while the compression is longer on the Sony, the Samyang has probably at least an equal amount of blur here. Again, I don't really see a huge difference. There's not really a lot of busyness or hard edges that one has that the other doesn't. And so I'm going to say for the most part, it's a draw once again. Now, if I went a little bit further out and chose a foreground object to see what happens there, a couple of things to observe. You can tell which lens is which because I use the opposite lens to focus on. And so the Samyang is focusing on the Sony on the Samyang. So looking at the actual subjects here, I think that the Sony delivers a little bit better contrast of the subject itself. However, there's also maybe a little bit more edging there on this particular transition zone, with the Samyang having a little bit of a softer transition. As we begin to look towards the background here, the Samyang I think is ever so slightly softer, but there's really not much of a difference. And so not, again, a whole lot to wrap our minds around here. Looking down into this extreme corner, I think that the lines here kind of grab my eye a little bit more on the Sony as opposed to the Samyang. But again, it's very, very close. The two lenses are not much different. Now, I set up this particular test to see how they would handle the transition of bokeh lights, or bokeh balls as they start to get towards the edge of the frame. And so a couple of things that we're going to see here. First, if we zoom in on the subject, the Sony is definitely the better performer up close, and there's more of a variance in their performance at close distances than what there is at, say, the chart testing distance, as we could see. The Samyang has a little bit more pronounced bokeh fringing, and you can see that as we move towards these, bokeh balls here, a little bit more obvious fringing as you move here. And as we go through here, the more you get off center, the more that this, the more fringing that the Samyang shows relative to the Sony. Now, the Sony does have a couple of extra areas of busyness here. You can just see that there's more busyness inside these bokeh circles, and you can also see a defined inner line, whereas that's not there on the Samyang. The Samyang, however, does have the fringing around the bokeh circles. We can also see that the Samyang retains a little bit more of a circular shape towards the edge of the frame, while the Sony moves a little bit more, lemon shape as opposed to the Samyang. And so, there's some give and take for both of them, depending on what your priorities are there. If we stop down to F2, basically the same pattern remains. The Sony is definitely still the stronger in terms of the close-up performance. A little bit more fringing on the Samyang, and the geometry is still a little bit favors the Samyang as far as that performance. And definitely that inner line is a difference between the two, as is the bokeh fringing. So in our final two real-world tests here, we're going to look at a couple of things. We're looking, number one, at the performance here in terms of contrast resolution. We're looking at the bokeh, and then we're also looking to see if there's any kind of noticeable color variance between the two. So first of all, up close here in terms of the detail, I definitely favor the contrast on the Sony, and I think that it's just rendering the fine details here better than what the Samyang is. There is a minor difference in color rendering here. It's really not significant, however. Samyang has had a reputation of being a little bit more kind of yellowy in the past. I don't find that has been as true with their most recent lenses, however, and I find that the colors are a little bit more neutral. Looking out here at this out of focus area, again, you can draw your own conclusions there. I don't really see a radical difference between the two. As I look at the transition to out of focus areas, it looks more similar than different to me. So in our final test here, where we actually introduce skin tones, you can see looking at them as a whole, and we'll buzz in here close for a moment and get these two lined up. But I would say that there isn't really a radical difference in skin tones that I can make out. Just a little bit different. There does seem to be a little bit of a difference in the way that the faces are rendered, with the Sony giving a little bit more of a slender look than what the Samyang does. So maybe a little bit more of a distortion that's doing just a little bit more pinkish distortion that's there. So again, let's look in here close, and you can see that there really isn't a huge amount of variance in the overall contrast. I do think that there is some extra pop to the Sony, just a little bit more contrast around the eyes, a little more punch. We'll go into 200%. So here at 200%, you can again see that there really isn't a huge amount of difference here. And both of them are doing a good job with the skin tones. Contrast looks good. And again, I think there's just a little bit more pop around the eyes, but there's really not a whole lot to take away in terms of a difference. If we look on towards like defocused area here, again, I think that the performance, you would have to just say it's more similar than what it is different. I mean, everything here looks pretty similar, and even like towards the defocus of the dog, it's a soft transition, this potted plant here. There's really not a huge difference to really set these apart. So as you can see, as before, there is some give and take there in terms of, I do really love the amount of just intense contrast that comes off the Sony Zeiss Planar. It's an amazingly sharp lens. And of course, as we've seen, it's a little more consistent across the frame than what the Samyang is. The Samyang is also a very sharp lens, but it doesn't have as intense levels of contrast at wide apertures as what the Sony does. And as we noted, the Sony is a little bit better in up-close performance. The Samyang, however, does have some advantages. It has better light transmission. It also has just as good, if not arguably softer bokeh from it. And so it has that going for it. At the end of the day, it really kind of comes down to what your own shooting priorities and maybe what your budget is. As you can see, I went with a neutral result here with the Laowa on my shirt here today. And so I'm not trying to pick a side here, but rather I'm trying to present to you the information for both and maybe make an informed decision for you. There are still aspects about the Sony Zeiss Planar that I think are still really special and maybe, you know, kind of next level relative to the Samyang. There are also areas where the Samyang delivers an equally good, if not better, performance. And when it comes to a lens that I would trust for IAF consistency and focus consistency, ironically, it's the Samyang that I would reach for in that situation. And so maybe that helps you to make an informed decision. And I don't know if the relative strengths of the Samyang or its relative weaknesses are enough to say, you know what, I would prefer to go with the tried and true with the Sony Zeiss Planar, or maybe Samyang, or if you got lots of money and you want the best lens in the class, check out the G Master. It is an amazing lens. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you'll look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my reviews of both of these lenses, also buying links for both of them, and I'll throw the GM in there for good measure. There's also linkage to follow myself or Craig on social media, to become a patron, to you can purchase channel merchandise, and of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.